What's up, everyone? It's Q from Retro Q Gaming, and yes, I'm intentionally using this footage for, well, you'll see now in a minute. So, what I want to talk about is the ebb and flow of genres when it comes to gaming. So, well, we'll start off with something akin to what you're seeing here. So, in my opinion, remember a few years ago, maybe, let's see, we're in 2017 now, so let's say anywhere between 4 and 7 years ago. Remember when the first person shooter genre was huge? I mean, even bigger than it is now. Yes, Call of Duty and Battlefield and all do insane numbers, as we already know, but remember when just the first person shooter genre was just so much bigger than it is now? And when you take that into consideration and you look at how many different genres, not genres, are how many different franchises were branching out and becoming a bit more action oriented just to kind of capture a little bit of the mass appeal of the first person shooter genre. So it was a big thing, and there was a time when first person shooter games were churned out. It was every month you'd have maybe two or three first person shooters, it felt like. And even if they were new entries in a series, or if they were just one off crappy no name games that no one's ever heard of and that never spawned a sequel, or if they were sequels to existing games, or if they were games that were yearly installments like Call of Duty or Battlefield or whatever it was. So you got the point, and eventually people got tired of this, as you see in declining sales numbers and people complaining online, and eventually the media, or not the media, the publishers and developers actually shifting away from them and taking breaks and things like that. So I'm talking, remember, 20, let's call it 2010 to 2013 again, when the first person shooter was huge. I remember I was personally burned out on first person shooters at that point. I had burned out, I'd say probably, I want to say mid 2011, if not even earlier. And it got to the point where I'd buy maybe one every 6 months, or maybe one every year, or two a year, which would be, staggered 2 weeks apart, because they'd be Christmas games and whatnot. But I remember playing Bioshock Infinite at the start of 2013, and I was so burnt out on him at that point. I literally resigned myself to giving up on first person shooters after Bioshock Infinite came out. And funny enough, I actually played Bioshock Infinite when it came out, and I did not like it at all. I thought it was extremely overrated, and everything about it was pretty poor except for the graphics on my first playthrough. Now, I have a different video that rectifies that, and it explains going back and playing it several months later and feeling different about it. But I want to take a quick look at a couple of other genres that have risen and fallen over the last few years, or specifically over the previous generation. So, let's go. All right, obviously we have the notorious and documented first-person shooters. So that is what it is. We pretty much covered that, and we're gonna just skip the rest of it. So, what else did we have? Another one that was hugely prolific. This one, you could argue, would have been the first person shooter before the first person shooter. Remember when rhythm games were massive, and they were the dog's bollocks. They were the hot item. They were the Wii of game software, basically. So you had your rhythm games. You had the likes of Rock Band, Call of Duty. There's tons of other one-off, smaller, no-name ones as well that we're not even going to bother mention. I think Ubisoft have a pretty popular one as well. I think it's like Just Dance, I think it is, maybe. So for a while, just everything was Guitar Hero, Rock Band, rhythm games. And they kept coming out with them in quick succession, what felt like year after year, sometimes even less. And some of them had those ones like Guitar Hero, Legends of Rock, Guitar Hero, The Beatles, or maybe it was Rock Band, The Beatles, I don't know. And it was like Guitar Hero, Metallica, and Guitar Hero, Aerosmith. And it eventually just completely oversaturated everything, that everyone just said, fuck it. And as well, there was the fact that this was in around the time of the major advent and revolution of DLC. So you had downloadable songs, which, obviously most of them you had to pay for, and that kind of fragmented the whole thing, especially when if you upgraded your game, depending on the game, some of the old ones that you may have spent 40, €50 or whatever on buying extra songs were now defunct. And fair enough, you have 10 different rock band discs. Maybe we want to play the Beatles, you put in that one. Maybe you want to play these old songs, you put in that one. It got a bit stale and a bit old. And the genre just fell flat and just died. And we all know they tried to make a big deal and they tried to have a big push with it fairly recently. I think it was 2016 when you had the new Rock Band and new Guitar Hero, and they both came out and no one cared. And they just flopped. And now I believe it's Mad Cats who used to help make that stuff and banked on it pretty hard. Well, they paid the price because they're bankrupt now. So that's another genre that was really had a really high popular, bright burning run and then just faded off into obscurity. Now no one wants to make a rhythm game, with the exception of Ubisoft, who want to make their rhythm/dancing game for the Wii, but not the Wii U or Switch, which I think is hilarious. I mean, it makes sense because at the end of the day, there's over 100 million Wiis out there, and the majority of people that still have and play their Wiis and buy Wii games are casual players for that kind of thing. Their families, their kids, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. So that's one of them. Let's move on to another one. This one is what I like to call YouTube bait. Now, this was a pretty popular genre. I'd say maybe 2012 to maybe 2015. I don't think it was too popular in 2016, but 2012 to maybe 15 or 16. Well, we call it 15 anyway, but it was when indie games had taken off, because indie games, we all know, used to be taboo, used to be a whole different thing to what indie games now are. And back then, when the height of YouTuber popularity was kicking off and people were, someone would show off a game and they have 20 million subscribers and suddenly that game just skyrockets to sales again. Developers and indie developers felt like they were rushing to make games that were strictly almost catered to a YouTuber playing them, just so they could fake a reaction to it, and then all their subscribers would buy it. And this one was prevalent in the first person jump scare survival horror, usually with no combat games. And don't get me wrong, some of them are good. Outlast's a really good game. Outlast 2 it's not as good, but it's still pretty good. And there's a couple of other good ones as well in that whole vein and that whole genre of games. But unfortunately, they have kind of been dying down a little bit lately, which is kind of okay, because once it gets a bit oversaturated and it's the standard, everyone is trying their hand, and it feels like you have a new one every 2 weeks, and it's a bit stale. I mean, wasn't Allison Road cancelled and, all of that? I'm pretty sure it was cancelled and then uncancelled and then partnered and then cancelled again, I think it was. That's a bit of a shame. But you get my point, and you get what I'm aiming at for the rise and fall of the genre. Next up is the last one I want to talk about, for the moment at least anyway. And this one feels like it's the current one that we're in now, and it feels like we're going to teeter off within maybe another year, if even, and we'll see how it goes. So this one, the one we're currently in at the moment, feels like the sandbox genre, and basically almost everything has to be a sandbox, and everything high profile has to be a sandbox, and these new games have to be sandbox, and these sequels that are from a series that hasn't had an entry in 10 years have to be a sandbox. The most notable example of this was Kojima, when Grand Theft Auto 5 released. Now, Grand Theft Auto is obviously one of the bigger and better sandboxes. When you look at the quality and just the scale of their games and everything you can do in them, they're usually considered maybe not the gold standard, but even they're up there. They're definitely up there. So when you look at Grand Theft Auto 5, okay, a game that has been historically, ever since its first installment, a sandbox game. So this one gets kind of a pass because it's always been a sandbox game ever since the 90s when it actually came out. So the big story is Metal Gear Solid 5, which hadn't released at the time, was apparently going to be much smaller in scale and scope and much more linear and all, which personally I think would have done wonders for the actual finished product, because MGS5 was trash. But it was supposed to be a lot smaller, a lot linear, a lot more tight and focused. But then Grand Theft Auto 5 came out and sold like $1 million of stock in one day. So oh sorry, $1 billion of stock. $1 million is nothing in gaming. $1 billion of stock in, I think it was either the first day or the first weekend. So Kojima delayed MGS5 to make it sandbox, simply because he saw the overwhelming, resounding success to the complete opposite of what he was making. And he was like, okay, we need to get in on this and get this kind of money. So that's one of the more historical, notable ones on there too. I want to rewind a little bit too, because that was in 2013 when Grand Theft Auto released. I want to say it was 2013, because I'm pretty sure there was an issue that they didn't release on the new consoles at the same time. So let's dial it back 2 years prior. 11th of the 11th, 2011. We all know what that date is. Skyrim. Now, Skyrim was one of the open world sandbox style games, which again, Elder Scrolls games have typically been open world sandbox. But Skyrim skyrocketed, no pun intended, or play on words, whatever, back to popularity of the sandbox genre and what was expected in both a Western style role playing game and with a working quality sandbox. So, because of that to me feels like it really kickstarted the mainstream popularity. I mean, sure, there was good sandbox games, there was high profile sandbox games, but look at all the coverage and hype and just media and generation and whatever that Skyrim in particular got for that genre. So it does feel like Skyrim kicked that off to its top level of interest and performance. And you have to remember, when, especially in a game like a sandbox game, a smaller indie game, like say maybe a horror game or something like that, they're going to be much easier and shorter to make. But when you look at a sandbox game, that's going to take a while. So let's use this as the example. We all know there's the crap Ubisoft stuff that they put out every year. That's, Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs, The Division, whatever. It's all the same stuff. Just has a different skin and it releases every 6 months. What's their new one? Ghost Recon Wildlands. There you go. Perfect. So let's go back anyway. You've got Skyrim 2011, GTA 2013, Metal Gear Solid 5 2015. We all know how that turned out. It was garbage. But let's see how it goes. So let's say this kicks off in 2011. Major studios and anyone with the not just talent, but the talent, ability, and say finances to actually make a quality open world sandbox is going to take several years. So it's going to take maybe a year of planning. You're into 2012 already. It's going to take maybe 2 to 3 years of development. You're already up to 2014, 2015. And when you look over the last couple of years, you've got stuff like Mad Max. We finally have another entry in the Just Cause series. There's so many of them as well. The Witcher is as a good example. We all know The Witcher's been in development for a good while, and that's kind of almost its own thing. Final Fantasy 15, granted, Final Fantasy 15 has troubled development for about 10 years, but look at what it fits in, and especially what it actually released as, with the bigger open world and all. I know they've kind of teased and shown off a little bit about that way back when, but it looks more open, especially after the likes of The Witcher and the likes of Skyrim have had such an influence on it. So the other one, the last big one I want to talk about in the same genre, and this one is mainly credited to Skyrim because the predecessor launched a week before Skyrim. That game is Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, a game which failed to sell 4 million copies over its lifetime on a system that has over 100 million units sold. So, there's multiple issues and complaints with Skyward Sword, even though it predates Skyrim by a minor part. One of the more common complaints, but not the most prevalent complaint, is the world and the layout of the actual game, the linearity of it. So what many people credit Skyrim with in respects to Legend of Zelda is what we see now in Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. It's basically Skyrim but Zelda. We all know that. So that's the more common version of that, the more common comparison that it draws from it. I mean, it makes perfect sense that Miyamoto and Aonuma, I always think I say his name incorrectly, that they would just sit down and they would say, okay, a couple of years from now, we're going to make a new Legend of Zelda game. Or maybe they didn't even properly start working on it for maybe another year or two. And then at that point, let's say they did. Let's say they waited a year and then they looked back and said, okay, what do we need to use as our blueprint? What do we need? What's big? What does everyone want? And straight away, in the same kind of genre almost, you have Skyrim. And you've got your big open sandbox game. And well, look how it turned out. I mean, we have Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, a game which many are considering a masterpiece, many are which considering the game of the year, many of which are considering the best Zelda game of all time. So you see my point. You see why it has that influence and why it feels like that it's had such an impact on it. So I still feel like we're in the sandbox era, if you will, when it comes to where we are in gaming now, at least where we are in gaming genres now. I still feel like we're in the sandbox era. I do think it was due to die this year, but I think Zelda saved it. Or not so much saved it, but I think Zelda prolonged its life. So I think it will die off at some point in 2018. Sure, there'll still be sandbox games. Ubisoft will be pushing them out every 6 months, as they usually do. But just in general, with the amount of other third parties and first parties and just new franchises, existing franchises, sequels, whatever, I think the amount of sandbox style ones we're going to see in the next, let's call it 18 months, is going to start slowing down. And then beyond 18 months, I think it's going to dry up nearly almost entirely, with your exception of your usual stuff like Red Dead Redemption, Fallout, Elder Scrolls, well, probably even Zelda now, the crap Ubisoft pumps out every 6 months. But you get my point. I think that's where we've hit on it now. So that brings me to my final point, which is going to be a considerably smaller and much shorter one, which we can probably end up in like a couple of sentences. So where do you think we're going to go next? What do you think is the next genre? What has been picking up as the kind of gaining momentum genre at the moment? Because I was looking around at stuff and I really can't think of it. I mean, when you look at, say, I was looking at what's extremely popular and selling extremely well over the last few years, other than the usual yearly installments, and most of them are still the same thing. I mean, you've got Overwatch from last year. It's still, at the end of the day, a first-person shooter. I mean, sure, you could argue it's the Team Fortress 2 style, but it's still a first-person shooter. Doom, I'm sure many things are going to be trying to copy Doom in the upcoming maybe 2 or 3 years. They're going to be going to the old school, more arcadey feel at the same time when it comes to first-person shooter versus the kind of like hyper-realistic stuff that they almost aim for nowadays. But again, it's a first-person shooter, so we'll see how it goes. I personally can't find anything just that I've been looking at that picks up in my mind that will be the next big thing when it comes to genres. I'd love to see that thing be JRPGs come back with a vengeance, because I mean, look at Persona, for example. The game's amazing, but I unfortunately don't think it's another rise of JRPGs. So what do you think it is? What do you think about the rise and fall of any genre, ones that we've covered here, ones that we haven't? Or what do you think we'll see next? Or what do you think we're in now? Whatever it is, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. You can follow me on Twitter, details in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the rest of the videos in my channel.